What if I told you that America first no longer means America pulling back, but America pushing forward harder and more forcefully than before? When Donald Trump returned to office, millions believed they were voting for restraint, for borders over bases, for rebuilding at home, not policing abroad, and yet Venezuela happened. U.S. forces captured Nicolas Maduro. The President of the United States openly declared that America would now run another country. That moment matters, not because it is shocking, but because it is revealing. Behind the language of isolation lies something very different, a growing comfort with coercion, force, and dominance. This is not withdrawal. This is not restraint. This looks uncomfortably like neo-imperialism, dressed in populist language. If you care about where American power is heading and what it means for the world, you'll want to stay with me. Because to understand Venezuela, we first have to understand the contradiction at the heart of America first. And that contradiction didn't appear overnight. At its core, America First was sold as a correction, a response to decades of strategic overreach and economic neglect. The argument was simple. The United States had done too much abroad and too little at home. Free trade hollowed out the middle class. Automation erased stable jobs. Endless wars consumed lives and trillions of dollars with little to show for it. So Trump promised a turn inward, less global responsibility, fewer entanglements, a narrower definition of national interest. But here is the problem. You cannot reduce global commitments without changing the structure of power that sustains them. And Trump never did. American troops remain deployed across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The United States continued to balance China, contain Russia, secure energy routes, and police instability. The machinery of empire stayed fully operational. What changed was not the system, but the language used to justify it. That gap between rhetoric and reality is the story we are really telling. And to understand why it exists, we need to go back, far back into America's strategic DNA. To grasp what is happening now, we have to step outside the present moment and look at history not as memory, but as muscle memory. In the 19th century, the United States followed a clear logic: expand at home, dominate the hemisphere, avoid deep entanglements overseas. The Monroe Doctrine was born from that worldview. It declared the Western Hemisphere America's sphere of influence and warned foreign powers to stay out. At the time, it worked. Geography helped. Two vast oceans created distance, insulation, a sense of natural security. Trump's 2025 national security strategy reaches back to this era with remarkable nostalgia. It explicitly calls for reviving the Monroe Doctrine, for reasserting American primacy in its own backyard, for preventing hostile powers from gaining footholds nearby. On paper, it sounds coherent. Focus close to home, reduce far-flung obligations, but history doesn't repeat cleanly. It collides with reality. The conditions that made hemispheric isolation viable no longer exist. Missiles ignore oceans. Cyber attacks bypass borders. Climate shocks ripple across continents. And so, what begins as historical revival quickly becomes strategic confusion. Because when you try to run 21st century power through a 19th century framework, something has to break. And that breaking point arrived not in theory, but in Venezuela. Venezuela was not an accident. It was a stress test, and the system failed it. When U.S. forces moved in and captured Nicolas Maduro, the justification sounded familiar. Narco-terrorism, regional instability, threats close to home, but the symbolism was far louder than the rationale. This was the United States removing a foreign leader and openly declaring its intent to run another country. A move that would have felt at home in 1898 when Washington seized Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, and transformed itself from a republic into an empire. Here is the deeper meaning. Trump did not intervene because America First demanded it. He intervened because America First could not contain the world it had created. The promise of restraint collided with the instinct to dominate, and domination won. If you believe the United States can simply pull back while maintaining control, Venezuela should disabuse you of that notion. Power, once projected, does not retreat quietly. It lashes out. If this analysis resonates with you, take a moment to share it, because these patterns shape far more than one country. But Venezuela was only the first visible crack. What followed was not strategy but reflex. And to understand that reflex, we have to expose the machinery operating beneath the slogans. What we're witnessing is not chaos. It is a mechanism, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. America First promises withdrawal. But withdrawal without structural reform creates a vacuum. And power hates vacuums. Trump's solution has been substitution, not transformation. When diplomacy feels slow, force feels decisive. When multilateralism feels constraining, unilateral action feels freeing. When global leadership becomes burdensome, dominance becomes tempting. This is how neo-imperial behavior emerges, not from ambition alone, but from strategic overcorrection. The administration wants fewer commitments, yet insists on preserving military overmatch everywhere that matters. It wants allies to carry more weight while threatening them with abandonment. It wants to deter China, contain Russia, stabilize the Middle East, and still claim the moral high ground of restraint. Those goals are incompatible. So the system compensates by coercing neighbors, by policing migration at the source, by using force close to home where the political costs appear lower. Venezuela fits this logic perfectly, not because it was essential, but because it was convenient. This is not isolationism. It is imperial management under populist branding. And once that machinery is in motion, it doesn't stop at one country. Which brings us to the second escalation, the moment when contradiction turns into acceleration. The second escalation didn't arrive with a single headline. It arrived as a pattern: Iran, Iraq, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, strikes on alleged drug boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Individually, each action could be defended. Collectively, they tell a different story. This is what happens when a strategy lacks a center of gravity. Force becomes the default instrument, not because it works, but because it is available. Trump presents himself alternately as peacemaker and enforcer, one moment offering grand deals, the next lashing out. That oscillation is not personal inconsistency. It is structural incoherence. The 2025 National Security Strategy calls for disengagement, yet simultaneously commits the United States to deterring China across the First Island chain. It urges Europe to take responsibility while keeping roughly 80,000 U.S. troops on the continent. It emphasizes diplomacy in the Middle East while reaffirming permanent interests that require permanent presence. This is escalation without direction, movement without destination. And here is the danger. When force is used without a clear strategic horizon, it doesn't resolve tensions. It multiplies them. What began as an effort to avoid forever wars risks becoming something more diffuse and more constant. And while these contradictions play out on the global stage, their consequences are already being felt somewhere closer by people who were promised protection but are now absorbing the costs. For you, this isn't abstract. It's personal, because while grand strategy drifts, you feel the consequences first. You feel it when labor shortages push up food prices, when construction slows because workers are gone, when hotels, farms, and service businesses quietly struggle to stay open. You were told the crackdown would restore order. Instead, it fractured the labor market. 2/3 of Americans now oppose the administration's immigration policy, not because they love chaos, but because they recognize reality. The United States needs immigrants. Its economy depends on them. And tariffs? You were promised protection. What you got was higher costs. Trump wants to revive an industrial past that no longer exists. But manufacturing no longer employs the masses. It never will again. Since Trump returned to office, 50,000 manufacturing jobs have disappeared, not returned, gone. So when force is projected abroad and walls are raised at home, the pressure doesn't vanish, it shifts onto you, onto your family, onto everyday affordability. If this feels like a betrayal, that's because it is a mismatch between promise and outcome. If this perspective helps you make sense of what you're experiencing, share it. Understanding is the first defense, because the ripple effects don't stop at America's borders. They radiate outward, reshaping alliances, stability, and the global order itself. What happens inside the United States never stays there for long. When Washington acts without coherence, the world recalibrates. Allies watch Venezuela and hear the echoes. If the United States is willing to seize control of a country in its own hemisphere, what does that mean for smaller partners elsewhere? Trust erodes quietly long before it breaks publicly. Europe is unsettled. Trump's rhetoric toward Canada and Greenland is not dismissed as theater. The mere suggestion of force against a NATO ally sends a shock through the alliance. History matters in Europe, and 19th century behavior is not reassuring. In Asia, the message is equally troubling. The United States claims it wants fewer commitments, yet insists on military dominance near China's shores. That contradiction fuels arms races, not stability. In the Middle East, nothing changes. Bases remain open. Sea lanes must be secured. Energy flows must be protected. So the world learns a lesson. America first does not mean America absent. It means America unpredictable. And unpredictability is not neutrality, it is a catalyst. It pushes rivals to hedge. It forces allies to diversify. It weakens the very order the United States claims it no longer wants to carry alone. Which brings us to the most important question of all. If the past cannot return and the present is unstable, what comes next? If the current trajectory holds, the future splits into three possible paths. The first is the optimistic scenario. America first evolves finally into strategic realism. The United States accepts that leadership does not require domination. It reforms alliances instead of threatening them. It narrows military goals, aligns means with ends, and invests at home without coercing abroad. This path is difficult but not impossible. It requires discipline and humility. The second is the middle scenario, and the most likely. The contradictions persist. Rhetoric and reality continue to diverge. The United States intervenes selectively, unpredictably, allies adapt, rivals probe. Nothing collapses, but nothing stabilizes either. A permanent state of friction becomes normal. Then there is the dark scenario. America leans fully into neo-imperial reflex. Force substitutes for strategy. Allies become liabilities. Institutions erode. A single miscalculation over Taiwan, Iran, or a NATO partner triggers a crisis the system cannot absorb. History is clear about one thing. Great powers rarely fall because they are weak. They fall because their strategies stop making sense. The future will not be decided by slogans. It will be decided by whether power and purpose are finally brought back into alignment. And that brings us to the final question, what this moment demands of all of us. This moment is not about Donald Trump alone. It is about whether the United States can still think strategically in a world it no longer dominates effortlessly. America first promised clarity. What it delivered was contradiction. A nation cannot preach restraint while practicing coercion. It cannot reject empire in words while reviving it in deeds. And it cannot govern a 21st century world with 19th century instincts. Venezuela exposed that truth. So did immigration. So did tariffs. So did the quiet unease spreading among allies. The lesson is simple but uncomfortable. Power without purpose corrodes. Purpose without realism collapses. And when the two drift apart, Citizens pay the price long before leaders do. The United States does not need to retreat from the world, but it does need a new grand strategy, one grounded in interdependence, restraint, and credibility. We are not there yet, but recognizing the failure of the current path is the first step towards something better. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, stay with this conversation. Share it. And join me in the next video where we ask what a viable American strategy for the 21st century might actually look like. Because history doesn't wait for clarity, it punishes its absence.